The air inside the John Deere dealership in the fall of '72 was thick with the smell of new paint, fresh rubber, and something else. A heady perfume of optimism that felt almost dizzying. It was the scent of money, easy money, flowing into the heartland like a spring flood. Corn was over $2 a bushel and climbing. The Russians were buying grain by the boatload, and every farmer in Cedar County felt like a king holding a royal flush. Art Jensen felt more like a man holding a well-worn but reliable pair of deuces. He stood at the parts counter, a cracked V-belt in his grease-stained hand, waiting for young Jimmy to find a replacement in the dusty catalogues behind him. Through the big plate glass window that looked out onto the lot, he could see the source of all the commotion. It was a monster, a gleaming green leviathan with a yellow grain head, wider than his pickup truck was long. A brand-new John Deere 6600 Side Hill, the dealer's first, and it was being delivered to Walt Miller. Walt was inside, holding court near the sales manager's desk. He wasn't signing papers so much as performing the act. His signature, a flamboyant flourish of a gold pen. He was a big man, florid in the face, with a laugh that boomed and filled any room he was in. He'd started with the same 80 acres his father had left him, just like Art. But Walt had a hunger for steel and soil that Art never quite understood. He'd leveraged that first 80 into a quarter section, then a full section, and now he was farming nearly 1,000 acres, most of it rented, all of it financed. "She's a beauty, ain't she, Art?" Walt's voice cut through the low murmur of the dealership. He'd spotted Art by the counter. Art turned, giving a slow nod. "She's big, Walt, that's for sure." Walt strode over, clapping Art on the shoulder, hard enough to make him rock on his heels. "Big is the name of the game. Earl Butts himself said it. Get big or get out." "This baby here," he said, hooking a thumb toward the window, "can cut 20 acres before you've even had your lunch. Air-conditioned cab, radio, hydrostatic drive. It's the future, Art. The future." He glanced down at the greasy belt in Art's hand. "What's that for?" "The old 55. She threw a belt on the straw chopper, Art said quietly. "Just a bit of wear." Walt chuckled, a low, condescending rumble. "Still running that old roundback? Lord, Art, my grandpa had one of those. How many acres you figure you're cutting a day with that thing? 10, 12, if the dew's off early and she doesn't plug up." "She gets the job done," Art said, his jaw tightening just a fraction. His John Deere 55 wasn't flashy. It was an open-station machine from the late 50s, with a canvas sunshade that was more patch than original fabric. It had a 4-cylinder gas engine that you had to start with a prayer and a good bit of choke, and it steered with the heavy, deliberate feel of a river barge. But he knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every groan and clatter it made. He'd bought it used 10 years ago for cash, and it hadn't cost him a dime in interest since. "Getting the job done isn't enough anymore," Walt said, leaning in conspiratorially. "It's about efficiency. Time is money. While you're out there wrestling with that old relic, getting covered in dust and chaff, I'll be sitting in my climate-controlled cab, listening to the ball game, and cutting twice the crop in half the time. The bank understands that. They're happy to lend you the money when they see you're investing in progress." The bank. That was the magic word for Walt. He spoke of the Cedar County Trust and Savings like it was a partner, a benevolent uncle who was helping him build an empire. To Art, the bank was a tool you used as little as possible, like a pry bar for an emergency. You didn't live with it. His father had drilled that into him during the lean years of the 50s. A man who farms his own land with his own iron sleeps sound at night, he'd always said. The minute you let the banker get a hook in you, you're not a farmer anymore. You're just a sharecropper in a brand new tractor. Jimmy finally came back with a new belt in a green and yellow sleeve. That'll be $6.42, Art. Art pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket and counted out the cash. As he did, Walt clapped him on the shoulder again. Tell you what, Art, when that old girl of yours finally gives up the ghost in the middle of harvest, you give me a call. For a price, I'll come over and clean up your fields for you. Wouldn't want you to lose the crop. The offer hung in the air, coated in a thick layer of pity and pride. It wasn't an offer of help. It was a declaration of superiority. The other farmers loitering by the coffee pot had heard it. They were looking at Art, then at Walt's new machine, and their allegiances were clear. They were dazzled by the chrome and the size, seduced by the promise of easy harvests and big money. Art was a relic, a stubborn holdout from a bygone era. He pocketed his change and picked up the new belt. Appreciate the thought, Walt. But the 55 and I, we have an understanding. I take care of her. She takes care of me. He gave a final nod and walked out into the bright autumn sunlight, the bell over the dealership door tinkling behind him. He didn't look back at the gleaming 6600. Instead, his eyes went to his own truck, a 10-year-old Ford F100 with a few dings in the fender, but an engine that always turned over. Paid for. Just like the land. Just like the combine, waiting for its new belt in the machine shed. He felt the weight of their judgment on his back, the silent consensus that he was a fool, that he was being left behind. And for a moment, a sliver of doubt crept in. Was he just being stubborn? Was his father's advice outdated in this new world of booming prices and limitless credit? Before we go any further, I have to ask you all a question, and I want you to be honest. What's your philosophy on this? Do you believe in running the old iron you own free and clear, even if it means more sweat and longer hours? Or do you take the risk, sign the note at the bank, and bet on the new, efficient machinery to get ahead? Let me know what you think in the comments down below, because what Art decided to do set the course for the rest of his life. The machine shed was Art's sanctuary. It smelled of cold steel, old oil, and the dry, earthy scent of the packed dirt floor. His tools hung in their proper places on the wall, a silhouette of each wrench and screwdriver painted behind it, so he'd know instantly if something was missing. This was a place of order and logic, a sharp contrast to the chaotic ambition he'd just witnessed at the dealership. His John Deere 55 sat in the center bay, its small grain head detached and resting on wooden blocks. It looked ancient and simple compared to Walt's new machine. The sheet metal was faded to the color of a tired old pea, and there were rust stains weeping from a dozen bolt heads. But to Art, it was a marvel of mechanical ingenuity. He knew its guts, the way the cylinder bars threshed the grain, the way the straw walkers separated it, the way the sieves cleaned it. It was a system he could understand, and more importantly, a system he could fix. He slid underneath the rear of the machine on a creeper, the new V-belt in hand. The straw chopper assembly was a greasy, grimy collection of pulleys and bearings. It took him the better part of an hour, working with a set of 3/4-inch wrenches, his knuckles getting scraped and bloody, to loosen the tensioner, work the old frayed ends of the broken belt off, and snake the new one into place. The air was cool, but sweat beaded on his forehead, tracing clean paths through the grime on his skin. He could hear the rhythmic clatter of Walt's new combine already working in the distance, a steady, powerful hum that was eating up acres. The sound was a constant reminder of the community's verdict. At the grain elevator the day before, waiting to unload a wagon of soybeans, he'd heard Charlie Becker and Tom Peterson talking. "Saw Walt's new 6600, Charlie had said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Art's tractor tire. "Thing's a spaceship. Said he'll be done with his beans by Friday." Meanwhile, Art still puttering along with that museum piece, Tom had replied, not bothering to lower his voice. "He's going to be out there till the first snow, I reckon. Too stubborn to see the writing on the wall." Even his wife, Sarah, was worried. She didn't understand the mechanics of it all, but she understood the whispers at church, the pitying looks from the other farm wives, whose husbands were buying new pickups and talking about winter vacations in Florida. "Art," she'd said last night over dinner, her hands twisting a dish towel in her lap. "Are you sure we're doing the right thing? The Millers just put in a new kitchen, brand new countertops and a dishwasher. Walt's wife, Carol, said they're looking at buying a lake cottage." "We have a good kitchen, Sarah," he'd said gently. "And we have a savings account. The Millers have a pile of banknotes as high as their new silo. There's a difference. But it feels like we're falling behind," she'd whispered. "It feels like everyone is moving forward and we're just standing still." He finished tightening the last bolt on the tensioner pulley and slid out from under the combine. He stood up, wiping his hands on an already black rag, and looked at the machine. Standing still. Maybe that's what it looked like from the outside. But to him, it felt like holding firm ground while the rest of the world was being swept away by a flood. The real test came a week later. He was halfway through his best field of corn, 120 acres of bottom ground that was yielding close to 150 bushels to the acre. The old 5005 was performing beautifully. The four-cylinder engine hummed its steady, reliable tune, and the machine was swallowing 2 rows at a time, spitting shelled corn into the grain tank and a plume of chopped stalks out the back. Art was in his element, standing on the operator's platform, the wind in his face, the smell of diesel exhaust and drying corn stalks filling his senses. He could feel the rhythm of the machine through the steel plate under his boots, a familiar and comforting vibration. Then it happened. A sudden, violent shudder, a high-pitched squeal of tortured metal, and then a loud bang that echoed across the field. The whole machine lurched to a stop, the engine dying with a final, wheezing gasp. Silence descended, broken only by the rustle of the corn stalks in the wind. Art's heart sank into his stomach. He knew that sound. It wasn't a belt or a simple clog. It was something deep, something broken. He climbed down and opened the side panel to the engine compartment. The smell of burnt oil and hot metal hit him like a fist. He saw it immediately. One of the connecting rods had let go. It had punched a grapefruit-sized hole right through the side of the engine block. Oil was pouring out onto the dry ground, forming a dark, spreading stain. The engine was destroyed. Finished, he stood there for a long time, just staring at the hole, the silence of the field pressing in on him. To the west, dark clouds were building, the bruised purple of a coming thunderstorm. The forecast had called for heavy rain, maybe even hail, starting that night and lasting for 2 days. He had 60 acres of his best corn still standing in the field, vulnerable. He heard the roar of a big diesel engine and looked up to see Walt Miller's new 6600 cresting the hill on the neighboring farm. It moved with an implacable, arrogant speed, its 6-row corn head devouring the crop. Walt was visible in the glass-enclosed cab, a silhouette in a clean, comfortable bubble, moving effortlessly across the landscape. Art felt a wave of despair wash over him, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. Walt's taunt from the dealership echoed in his head. "When that old girl of yours finally gives up the ghost, you give me a call." His pride felt like a lead weight in his gut. To call Walt would be to admit defeat, to concede that he was right all along. It would mean paying his smug neighbor to finish his own harvest, a humiliation that would be the talk of the county for years. He walked back to the machine shed, his boots feeling heavy. He thought about his options. He could call the dealer, but a new engine block, if they could even find one for a machine that old, would cost a fortune and take weeks to arrive. The crop would be ruined by then. He could call one of the other neighbors, but they were all busy with their own harvests, racing the same storm. He sat on his workbench, the silence of the shed pressing in. His father's words came back to him. A man who farms his own land with his own iron sleeps sound at night. He hadn't slept soundly in weeks. He'd been listening for every new knock and rattle from the old combine, waiting for this exact moment. Then his eyes fell on something in the far corner of the shed, covered in a dusty tarp. It was another engine, sitting on a wooden pallet. It was the original engine from his John Deere 4020 tractor. 5 years ago, he'd upgraded the 4020 with a more powerful engine from a salvage yard to handle his new 6-bottom plough. The old engine was still good, just underpowered for heavy tillage. He'd kept it, thinking it might be useful for parts someday. An idea, desperate and probably foolish, began to form in his mind. The combine engine was a Tudor 19 cubic-inch 4-cylinder gas. The old tractor engine was a 303 cubic-inch 6-cylinder diesel. They weren't even remotely the same. The mounting bolts wouldn't line up. The flywheel housing was different. The radiator connections, the fuel lines, the throttle linkage. Nothing would match. It was an impossible task. It would require cutting, welding, fabricating new mounts from scratch. It would take days. He looked out the door at the darkening sky. The wind was picking up, making the big doors of the shed creak. He had maybe 18 hours before the storm hit. It was impossible. A fool's errand. He stood up, walked over to the corner, and pulled the tarp off the old 4020 engine. It was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, but underneath it was solid iron. He ran a hand over the valve cover. It was a long shot. It was more than a long shot. It was a prayer aimed at a hurricane. But it was his only shot. He wouldn't call Walt. He wouldn't surrender. He would fight. He grabbed his cutting torch and a set of heavy-duty wrenches. The race against the storm, and against everything he was trying to prove, had begun. The years between 1973 and 1978 were a golden age, a fever dream for American agriculture. The Soviet grain deal had opened the floodgates, and commodity prices stayed high and steady. Land values in Cedar County doubled, and then doubled again. The local banker, Mr. Henderson, went from being a cautious lender to a smiling evangelist of expansion. The government was guaranteeing loans, interest rates were manageable, and the prevailing wisdom, preached from the pages of Farm Journal to the tables at the local diner, was that this was the new normal. The boom would never end. Walt Miller rode that wave like a champion surfer. He was the poster boy for the new era of farming. The money from his massive, efficient harvests flowed like a river. After the 73 season, he traded his year-old 6600 for a brand new 17700, the biggest combine John Deere made. He bought a 4-wheel drive versatile tractor for his fall tillage, a machine so large it looked like it could pull the courthouse off its foundation. He bought the 160 acres to the north of Art's farm, paying a price per acre that made old-timers gasp. Then he bought another 240 acres to the west. He built a new machine shed, a vast steel structure that dwarfed Art's old wooden barn, and filled it with new, bigger implements. Walt's success made Art's philosophy look not just outdated, but foolish. Art had managed to perform a miracle that stormy night back in '72. working for 17 straight hours under the harsh glare of a single trouble light, he had cut, welded, and wrestled that six-cylinder diesel from the 4220 into the engine bay of his 55 combine. He'd fabricated new motor mounts from scrap steel, rerouted the fuel lines, and cobbled together a throttle linkage using parts from 3 different machines. It was an ugly, Frankenstein-like creation. But when he turned the key just as the first drops of rain began to fall, the diesel engine had roared to life with a deep-throated power the old gas engine never had. He'd managed to get the last 60 acres out of the field, finishing just as the downpour began in earnest. He felt a deep sense of pride in that accomplishment, but in the eyes of his neighbors, it only cemented his reputation as a stubborn eccentric. He hadn't invested. He'd just patched. He hadn't progressed. He'd just survived. During the boom years, Art and Sarah lived comfortably, but simply. The high crop prices meant they were more prosperous than ever before. But Art's reaction was the opposite of Walt's. He didn't see the boom as an opportunity to get bigger. He saw it as a once-in-a-lifetime chance to get secure. He paid off his operating loan from the bank within months of harvest each year. He built up a substantial cash reserve in a savings account. He systematically improved the land he already owned, spending his money on drainage tile to make his wet spots more productive, and building a new grain bin with a modern drying floor, allowing him to store his corn and sell it later in the year when prices were typically higher. Every one of these decisions was quiet, logical, and nearly invisible to the outside world. All his neighbors saw was the same old Ford pickup, the same modest house, and the same old John Deere 55, now rumbling with the distinctive clatter of a diesel engine it was never meant to have, chugging through the fields while shiny new combines worked all around him. The talk at the diner was merciless. Art Jensen's sitting on a gold mine, and he's still digging with a teaspoon, Tom Peterson declared one morning over coffee. He's scared, Charlie Becker added. His old man went through the Depression and filled Art's head with all that nonsense about debt. He doesn't realize things are different now. You got to use the bank's money to make money. It's the only way. Even Art started to question himself. He'd watch Walt Miller's massive operation, the convoys of new trucks hauling grain, the sheer scale of it all, and feel a pang of something he didn't want to admit was envy. Walt had a new boat. He took his family to Hawaii. His kids had new clothes and new cars when they turned 16. Art's son, David, was driving the same old Ford pickup Art had driven in high school. "Dad, why don't we get a new combine?" David asked one sweltering afternoon in '77, as they were trying to replace a worn-out bearing on the 55's grain elevator. Grease was everywhere, and their knuckles were raw. "The Millers don't have to do this. Their stuff never breaks down." "Their stuff is brand new, David," Art said, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "And it's owned by the bank. This," he said, tapping the faded green metal of the combine, "is ours. There's a difference. It just feels like we're working twice as hard for half as much," David muttered, and Art didn't have a good answer for him. The turning point, the first hint that the endless blue sky might have a storm cloud hiding in it, came in the late summer of 1979. Art was at the bank to deposit a check from the sale of some stored soybeans. Mr. Henderson, the banker, called him into his office. The banker's perpetual smile seemed a little strained, his face a little paler than usual. "Art, good to see you," he said, waving him into a chair. "Just wanted to chat for a moment." He shuffled some papers on his desk. "Things are changing a little. The Federal Reserve is trying to get a handle on this inflation. They're talking about raising interest rates, raising them significantly." Art nodded. He'd heard the news on the radio. Inflation was out of control. The price of everything, from fuel to fertilizer to a loaf of bread, was skyrocketing. "Now, for a man like you, it's not a major concern," Mr. Henderson continued, leaning forward. "You run a tight ship, very little debt. Your operating loans are always short-term. But some of your neighbors, well, they're a bit more exposed." He didn't say Walt Miller's name, but he didn't have to. "A lot of these expansion loans we wrote in the last few years were on variable rates," the banker said, his voice dropping. "We all thought the good times would keep rolling. A 1 or 2% jump in the prime rate, we could handle that. But they're talking about, well, the numbers they're talking about are frightening." He looked Art straight in the eye. "You keep doing what you're doing. Your father was a wise man. He understood that a farm isn't a factory. It's a living thing, and sometimes it needs to breathe, not just grow." Art left the bank with a chill running down his spine, despite the August heat. The banker's words were a warning, a crack in the facade of prosperity that had defined the entire decade. That evening, he stood on his back porch, looking out over his fields. The corn was tall and green, the tassels golden in the setting sun. It was a picture of peace and abundance. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a deep and profound unease. In the distance, he could hear the faint, familiar clatter of his own machinery as David finished up the last of the hay baling. It was a slow, steady, mechanical rhythm. It was the sound of a man who owned his own iron. And in that moment, it sounded less like the beat of a relic from the past and more like the steady, persistent heartbeat of a survivor. The year 1980 dawned not with a sunrise, but with the cold grey light of a coming blizzard. The change wasn't just in the weather, it was in the numbers. On the radio, between songs by Kenny Rogers and the Eagles, a somber voice from the Financial Report announced that the prime interest rate had climbed to 15%. Then, a few months later, 18%. By the end of the year, it would kiss 21%. The numbers were abstract, but in Cedar County, they felt as real and as brutal as a physical blow. For Art Jensen, the numbers were a cause for caution. For Walt Miller, they were a death sentence delivered on bank letterhead. The first visible crack in Walt's empire appeared not in a ledger, but in a field of soybeans that October. His magnificent John Deere 7700, the pride of the county, sat silent in the middle of a half-cut field for 3 straight days. The problem wasn't simple. Not a belt or a bearing that a man could fix with a wrench and some grit. The hydrostatic transmission, the complex heart of the machine's propulsion, had failed. It was a sealed unit, a marvel of modern engineering that required a specialist from the dealership in Des Moines, 100 miles away. The specialist arrived in a new service truck, armed with diagnostic tools that looked like they belonged in a hospital. He spent a day confirming the transmission was shot, and another day waiting for the replacement to be shipped in. The bill, as the talk at the diner went, was over $10,000, more than Art had paid for his entire farm, land and all, back in the 50s. While the giant combine sat idle, a testament to expensive vulnerability, Art's old 55 chugged along. Its diesel heart, the one he'd transplanted himself, beat with a steady, reliable rhythm. He finished his own soybeans, then quietly went over and helped his elderly neighbor, Frank, finish his. The pressure on Walt was immense. The cost of fuel had nearly doubled. The price of nitrogen fertilizer, tied to the cost of natural gas, had gone through the roof. And now, the interest on his massive operating loans and equipment notes was compounding at a terrifying rate. He had borrowed money at 8%, assuming the good times would last forever. Now he was paying 20%, and the price of corn had fallen below $3 a bushel after President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The very market that had built Walt's kingdom had vanished overnight. He was a man caught in a vice. The cost of his inputs was squeezing him from one side, the cost of his debt from the other, and the value of his crop was collapsing in the middle. He started selling things. First to go was the new four-wheel drive Versatile, sold to a big operator 2 counties over. He went back to using his older, smaller John Deere 4630 for tillage, a fine tractor, but one that meant his fall ploughing would take twice as long. Then he sold a new grain truck. Each sale was a public admission of distress, and the whispers in the community grew louder. Art saw Walt at the parts counter one afternoon. The usual boom of his voice was gone, replaced by a quiet, strained tone. His face, once florid and confident, was pale and drawn. He was arguing with the parts manager over the price of a set of sickle sections, a bill of maybe $50. He looked up and saw Art watching him, and for a moment a flicker of the old pride returned, mixed with a deep, haunting shame. He paid for the parts and left without another word. Art felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. He just felt a profound sadness. He saw a good farmer, a man who loved the land, being broken on the wheel of his own ambition and a system that had encouraged it. The banker, Mr. Henderson, had been right. The farm wasn't a factory. It was a living thing, and Walt had pushed it too hard, leveraged it too far, and now it was breaking. That winter, Art did something he hadn't done in years. He went through his old 55 combine piece by piece. He and his son, David, pulled every chain, checked every bearing, and measured the wear on the cylinder bars. David, who had once complained about the old machine, now worked with a quiet intensity. He had seen what was happening to the Miller family, to his friends at school, whose fathers were facing the same pressures. He was beginning to understand the brutal math of it all. "Dad," he said, one cold Saturday, his breath misting in the frigid air of the machine shed. "I think the main auger bearing is getting a little loose. We should probably replace it before next fall." Art looked at his son, his hands black with grease, his face serious with concentration, and felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with money or acres. "That's a good idea, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's a very good idea." They were not just maintaining a machine, they were preserving a way of life. The slow, steady work felt like a prayer against the chaos that was consuming the world outside the machine shed doors. The full storm of the farm crisis broke over Cedar County in 1982. It was a slow, agonizing collapse. The foreclosure notices started appearing, tacked to the bulletin board at the post office like funeral announcements. The Peterson farm, a century farm, was the first to go. Then the Beckers lost their hog operation. Every auction was a communal wake, attended by neighbors with hollow eyes and grim faces, watching as a family's entire life was sold off piece by piece to strangers. The air of optimism that had defined the 70s was gone, replaced by a thick fog of fear and despair. Walt Miller held on longer than most, a testament to his sheer grit and the massive cash flow he had generated during the good years. But it was a losing battle. He was selling land now, not just iron. He sold the 240 acres to the west to an insurance company from Chicago. The price per acre a full third less than what he had paid for it just 5 years earlier. The sale barely covered the interest payments for that year. He was treading water in a tidal wave. The bank was no longer his friend. Mr. Henderson had been forced into early retirement, replaced by a sharp-suited man from the regional office named Thompson, who looked at farmers not as people, but as columns on a balance sheet. Thompson saw Walt's debt-to-asset ratio and his negative cash flow, and he saw a problem that needed to be liquidated. The notice for the Walter Miller Farm auction appeared in the local paper in the fall of 1983. It was a full-page ad listing everything from the house and the home 80 acres to the last wrench in the shop. The John Deere 7700 Combine was listed right at the top, its photograph a sad reminder of a bygone era of limitless hope. The news hit Art like a physical blow. He and Sarah sat at their kitchen table, the newspaper spread between them. Sarah began to cry softly. Carol was just elected president of the church ladies' circle, she whispered. What are they going to do? Where will they go? Art had no answers. He thought of that day in the dealership a decade ago, of Walt's booming laugh and his condescending offer of help. He had spent years feeling a quiet resentment, a stubborn need to prove Walt wrong. But now, with the proof laid out in black and white on the newspaper, all he felt was an empty, aching sorrow. Walt hadn't just been wrong. He had been ruined. The system had chewed him up and was about to spit him out. While his neighbors were going under, Art's farm was an island of stability. His savings account, which had seemed so quaint and old-fashioned, was now his fortress. He used the cash to prepay for his fuel and fertilizer, buying in bulk at a discount. His grain bins, built with cash during the good years, allowed him to hold his corn and sell it when the market showed brief flickers of life, avoiding the harvest-time price slump. His greatest asset, however, was his old combine. The John Deere 55, with its mismatched engine and faded paint, was a masterpiece of financial efficiency. It burned half the fuel of Walt's 7700. When a part broke, Art could usually find a replacement at a salvage yard for a few dollars, or fabricate one himself in his shop. He wasn't paying a dealer mechanic $100 an hour. He wasn't paying a dime in interest. The machine's slowness, once a source of shame, was now its greatest virtue. It forced him to be methodical, to plan his harvest carefully, to work with the weather instead of trying to beat it. The old combine didn't just harvest his crops. It enforced a discipline that was keeping him solvent. One evening, David came into the house after a long day of dissing stalks. He sat down at the table, looking exhausted, but resolute. I was over at the elevator, he said quietly. Charlie Becker was there. The bank took his tractor right out of the field. He didn't even get to finish his fall tillage. He looked at Art, his eyes filled with a new understanding. I used to hate that old combine, Dad. I used to be embarrassed by it. But now I get it. It's not about how fast you go. It's about being able to keep going. Art reached across the table and put a hand on his son's shoulder. Your grandfather would be proud of you, David. He always said the land has a way of teaching you the lessons you need to learn. In the midst of the widespread failure, Art's own legacy was taking root. Not in the acquisition of more land, but in the wisdom being passed from one generation to the next. He was surviving, and in the heartland of the 1980s, survival was the only victory that mattered. The day of the Miller auction was cold and grey, with a raw November wind that whipped across the farmyard, tearing at the auction bills stapled to the side of the barn. The crowd was large but subdued, a gathering of ghosts. They were Walt's friends and neighbors, men who had shared coffee with him for 20 years, and they moved with the slow, somber purpose of pallbearers. They picked over the tools and equipment, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and a terrifying awareness of their own vulnerability. This could be any one of them. Art arrived not in his pickup, but in his wife's sedan. He didn't want to be seen as a vulture looking for a bargain. He parked down the road and walked up the long lane, the same lane he'd seen Walt's new 6600 delivered to a lifetime ago. He saw Walt standing near the house, a stranger in his own yard, his hands jammed in his pockets, his shoulders slumped. Carol was inside, the curtains drawn. The auctioneer, a man with a practiced, cheerful cadence, sounded jarringly out of place, his voice a frantic cry in a cathedral of sorrow. "All right, folks, let's get started here. A fine line of equipment, well maintained, ready to go to work for you." The smaller items went first: wrenches, chains, fuel barrels. Then came the big machinery. The John Deere 7700 combine, the symbol of Walt's ambition, was driven onto the line. It still gleamed, a monument to a fallen king. The bidding was sluggish, pathetic. The machine that had cost nearly $100,000 just a few years before sold for $22,000 to a corporate farm from out of state. The banker, Thompson, stood by his car, writing in a notepad, his face impassive. Each fall of the auctioneer's hammer felt like a nail being driven into a coffin. Art didn't bid. He wasn't there for the iron. He waited until the auctioneer announced a short break before they were to sell the real estate. The house, the buildings, and the home, 80 acres. He walked over to Thompson, the banker. "Mr. Thompson," Art said, his voice steady. "I'm Art Jensen. I farm next door." Thompson gave him a curt nod. "I know who you are. Your file is the only pleasant reading I've had in this county." "I'm not interested in bidding on the land in a public auction," Art said quietly. "It's not right. But I have a cashier's check in my pocket. It's for what land was worth around here 10 years ago, before all this madness started. I'll buy the home 80, the house, and the buildings. Cash. Today. My only condition is that you cancel the public sale of the property." Thompson stared at Art, his sharp, cynical eyes narrowing. He was a man who understood numbers, and Art's offer was far below the land's appraised value, even in the depressed market. But a public auction was a risk. If the bidding was weak, he might get even less. Art's offer was a sure thing. More than that, he sensed something else at play, a principle he didn't understand but could recognize as powerful. "Why?" Thompson asked, genuinely curious. "You could probably get it for less if you wait for the bidding." "Because a man's home shouldn't be a spectacle," Art said simply, "and that land should be farmed by a miller." After a long moment, Thompson gave a single decisive nod. He walked over to the auctioneer, and a few minutes later, the announcement came over the loudspeaker that the real estate had been sold privately and was withdrawn from the auction. A murmur went through the crowd. Art found Walt by the side of the machine shed, staring out at the empty space where his combine used to sit. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. "Walt," Art said softly. Walt turned, his eyes filled with a weary, beaten shame. "Come to say I told you so, Art. Go ahead. You've earned the right." "No," Art said, shaking his head. "I came to talk about next year." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. It was a simple, one-page document. "I just bought your home place. The house, the barns, the 80 acres. I want to rent it to you. The rent will be 1/3 of the crop, paid after harvest. You live in the house as long as you want. You farm the land. It's your place." Walt stared at him, his mouth agape. He looked at the paper, then back at Art, his eyes filling with tears for the first time that day. "Why? After everything, all the stupid, prideful things I said." "Because we're neighbors," Art said. "And this whole mess. It wasn't just you, Walt. It was everyone. The bankers, the government, the magazines. They sold us all a bill of goods. Some of us were just too stubborn or too scared to buy it." He held out his hand. "We'll get through this." Walt looked at Art's calloused, grease-stained hand, and for the first time in more than a decade, he took it, The years that followed were lean, but they were years of healing. The story of what Art Jensen did at the Miller auction became the new legend of Cedar County. The diner talk was different now. The measure of a man was no longer the size of his equipment, but the strength of his character. Art, the quiet man with the old combine, became the moral center of the community, a man sought out for his advice, his wisdom respected by all. He and David slowly expanded their own operation, buying 2 neighboring farms from families who had simply had enough and wanted to move away. They paid fair prices, in cash, never taking on debt. Walt, humbled and hard-working, farmed his home 80 acres with old, mismatched equipment he bought for pennies on the dollar at other auctions. He became a good farmer again, focused not on expansion, but on stewardship. He and Art became true friends, their bond forged in the crucible of the crisis. One warm autumn evening in the late 1980s, Art stood by the fence line, watching his grandson, a boy of 10, sitting in the seat of the old John Deere 55. The combine was mostly retired now, kept in the shed like a trusted old horse put out to pasture. But Art started it up once in a while, letting his grandson imagine he was driving it. David came and stood beside him. The farm was his now, mostly. He ran it with a sharp mind and his father's cautious heart. "You know," David said, a smile in his voice, "I was thinking we should probably restore that old thing. A new coat of paint, fix the dents, for old times' sake." Art looked at the faded green machine, at the ugly, beautiful welds holding the 6-cylinder diesel in place, at the rust stains that were like wrinkles on an old man's face. Each floor was a chapter in their story of survival. "No," Art said, putting an arm around his son's shoulders. "Let's leave it just the way it is. It's not supposed to be pretty. It's supposed to remind us." He looked out across the fields, golden in the setting sun. He saw the land he owned, free and clear. He saw his son, a good man, ready to carry on. He saw Walt Miller's house in the distance, the lights on, a family secure in their home. He had not gotten big. He had not gotten out. He had held his ground, and in doing so, he had held his world together. The low, rumbling clatter of the old diesel engine in the shed was more than the sound of a machine. It was the enduring, unconquered heartbeat of the farm.